and slogan on my sweatshirt today because she is the first black woman to run for president on a major party ticket, and she is also the first black woman to be elected to Congress. Through Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, a nonpartisan nonprofit, we work to amplify the voices of power of black women here in the Midwest so that they can be better advocates on behalf of the issues that matter most to them. I am honored to be named a Dole Fellow with the revered Institute of Politics here at KU, the Dole Institute of Politics, named for Congressman Bob Dole. And I'm excited to be having this discussion series today. What is black women's role in politics? So with that, we'll start with a little housekeeping. The Dole Institute is working to make sure it is on the cutting edge of innovation. And in order to do that, we've been very intentional about making sure that these sessions are hybrid. And so there are folks watching us live on YouTube and folks here in the event space at the Dole Institute. If you're watching us live on YouTube, you can join the conversation by emailing us at dolequestions@ku.edu. We will take those questions during the Q&A section, and you can join the conversation from the comfort of your home. But those of you who have joined us today, you'll still have the opportunity to ask your questions, to get your questions in. And with that, we will start with introductions. To my left, we have Stacey Knoell. Thank you for joining us, Stacey. Stacey is the Governor Kelly appointed Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. She comes to serve in the governor's administration from a bid for the Kansas State Senate seat in District 9. In addition to her work on the commission, she has also led the 3rd Congressional District Chapter for the Kansas Interfaith Action Organization. Stacey has a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Iowa and a degree in deaf communications and interpreter training from St. Louis Community College. She received her teaching certificate through Kansas University's Transition to Teaching program, which specifically recruited math and science teachers for the Kansas City, Kansas School District. Previously, Stacey worked in the public schools as a sign language interpreter at Blue Springs South High and a math teacher at Fairfax Alternative High School and Central Middle School in Kansas City. Thank you for joining us, Stacey. Next, we have Reverend Dr., and who I call soror because we share the same sorority. Dr. Gould, what sorority is that?
Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated.
Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The best sorority in the United States. You might argue that. Go check Google. Yes,
Check it.
Check Google. It will verify that as a fact. Dr. Reverend Soror Gould is joining us today from St. Louis and is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal. I'm learning how to say things today. AME. Church, having served for 9 years as a senior pastor at Quinn Chapel AME Church in Jefferson City. She also serves as the executive director of Missouri Faith Voices, a Faith in Action Federation. She answered the call to serve when she served on the front lines after the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And since then, her voice has taken her across the world, from Ghana to Palestine to even the White House. She's even testified in Congress regarding debt collection and financial predators, as part of a national movement to regulate predatory lending. Dr. Gould is featured in the film Rigged, the voter suppression playbook. She's a movie star too. Not only is she part of my sorority, she's a movie star. And she's an alumni of Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville and Columbia College. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Eden Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry from United Theological Seminary. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Reverend Soror Gould.
Thank you for this opportunity.
And with that, thank you all for joining me today on such a rainy but cozy day here in KU for our discussion, A Black Women's Place is in Politics. And as we do in most of these sessions, I'd like to do some level setting to make sure we're on the same page when we have these discussions. And Dr. Gould, I'd like to start with you, and Stacey, feel free to interject. When we talk about a black woman's place in politics, black women have always seemed to find their place in politics, whether politics has created a space for them or not. Shirley Chisholm is known for a saying, and I'm sure you all probably know it very well, if they don't give you a seat at the table,
Bring a chair.
Bring a folding chair. Bring your own
bring a
chair.
folding chair.
Yes,
That's
because there always hasn't been a space for Black women in politics. Dr. Gould, can you give us just a little background and context on Black women's historical engagement in politics, or even just civic engagement and advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about Black women's place in politics, it is certainly in the seats as candidates, as elected officials. I'm a community organizer, so it is also in grassroots organizing that gets people to the seats, right? I have to think about our beloved Sojourner Truth and that famous 1851 speech that she made at a conference that she wasn't exactly welcomed at. She was fighting for women's voters' rights. We know that we celebrated that 100th anniversary, but that didn't include Black women. It included white women. And she posed the question, ain't I a woman? And so Black women have been really posing that question since then. All throughout history, we can think about frontline people such as Fannie Lou Hamer, who was fighting for the right to vote. Our role in politics has always been to advocate for others. Ella Baker, who worked as a community organizer. Dr. King and all of the others get the credit, but there were the Ella Bakers and other women, Black women, behind the scene working to ensure that we had a place. And not just a place in the voter line, but also a place in esteemed elected official seats. Over the last 5 years, over the last 5 presidential campaigns specifically, Black women have been the most consistent voting bloc. 2020 was no different. If it wasn't for Black women in America, oftentimes, particularly on one side of the aisle, the seats might not have been awarded.
And when you think about, I think that's a great context, but when I think about Shirley Chisholm, for instance, she was the first Black woman elected to Congress. That wasn't until 1968, so that wasn't very long ago. When you think back to the Women's Suffrage March, which was in the early 1900s, Black women marched in the Women's Suffrage March at the behest of not only those on the sideline, but the white women who also marched and maybe didn't want them marching with them. And so there seems to be a long history of activism that has led to Black women being able to obtain seats in politics. Can you talk more about how the grassroots engagement and activism has paved the way for Shirley Chisholm or for now Vice President Kamala Harris to be where they are, directly engaged in politics as politicians, as operatives that we see today?
Yeah, and we, I don't know how I didn't say this when we talk about the suffrage march. Our beloved sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, was the only organized group of women. There were other Black women there. Ida B. Wells was there, but it was our first act to take to the streets and be a part of this march that people did not want us in. I think that the role of Black women has always been at the forefront of making way for others because we have bore the struggle. We really understand what it means to be excluded. And so we really work tirelessly to make sure that others are included. Organizing really makes a difference when we really take the power that has always belonged to the people and should be the people's power and really reallocate that power away from the majority, away from politicians, back to just ordinary citizens. We think about Fannie Lou Hamer, one of my heroes, and she was just an undereducated, underpaid, ordinary Black woman who fought her way all the way to the DNC to say, hey, we belong here, right? And that is the kind of activism and organizing that it has always made a way for the election, whether we're talking about Shirley Chisholm, Maxine Waters. Our modern day best example of that would be Stacey Abrams, who literally, and we can argue about semantics, but all of those rules and fraudulent laws that were put in place around voting and continue to be put in place in Georgia, as well as many other states in America.
Including here in
Yeah.
Missouri and
Yeah.
Kansas. We've seen
Kansas and
voter
Missouri.
suppression efforts.
Last year in Missouri, we had the third highest number of proposed voter restriction laws in the entire country. And so there are 47 states, and neither of these border states are excluded, that have those laws. And it has always been grassroots organizing, which is led by ordinary people whose names you won't see in books, who they don't get invited to the panels, right? Because nobody really knows them. They're working in the background to ensure that hardworking Americans are actually equally represented in political offices. And the beauty of organizing, I'm a faith leader, and Missouri Faith Voices is a faith-based, we organize congregations of all kinds, all shades of religion. But the beauty of that organizing actually happens when we actually find people who are most impacted. And so we go and find who are the people that are actually left out, whether it was from the suffrage rights in 1919 or the DNC in 1964 or 2020. Who are the people that are left out, right? Who are, using faith language, the least of these? Who's been excluded? And organizing actually takes those people and helps them to use their own voice to actually build the kind of power that helps them to understand that they matter, and therefore their votes matter, and the ideas and the values that they have that matter to their families also matter. And it really centers those stories as opposed to this hegemonic narratives that we get that does not represent like ordinary people.
And how would you define organizing, or who or what an organizer is, just for context?
An organizer, in very simplest terms, is a member of the community that works to empower and to equip other ordinary members of the community to contest for power in the public square. Sometimes you contest for power at the ballot box. Sometimes you contest for power at the door of the governor's office, the congressional representative's office, and tell them, no, all of God's children need Medicaid expansion. It depends on the issue, but an organizer actually takes the issues that comes from the people and amplifies those issues and equips people to actually build the kind of power that will impact their own lives long term.
Thank you for that context, because we hear these terms,
Yeah.
organizer, operative, elected
Absolutely.
official, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page about how we're using these terms. Thank you, Councilwoman Robinson, for joining us. When you are in public service and you're doing the work, there's never a dull day. You're always busy, so we're so excited to have you. And just to give you a quick introduction and to loop you in the conversation, Councilwoman Robinson currently serves as the City Council representative for the 3rd District in Kansas City, Missouri. She also serves as the Executive Director for the Black Healthcare Coalition, where she's responsible for leading the organization's efforts to create health equity and to address social determinants of health and reduce health disparities. Councilwoman Robinson previously served on the school board for the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and of the 5 years she served, 3 of those were spent serving as the board chair. She also has previous experience having served at the Ad Hoc Group Against Crime as a director for crisis intervention. Thank you for joining us, Councilwoman Robinson.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we had a very special moment about Delta Sigma Theta sorority. We hate you missed that, but
Wow, I'm the odd person out here then.
well, you're still a sister. At the
Well,
end of the
thank
day,
you.
with
I appreciate
Delta, you're
that.
AKA.
Thanks for
you
letting
are
me in.
still-
It's all
Well,
good.
I am an AKA, so let's just be clear about that.
Okay.
I think we need to turn your mic off now. Just kidding, just kidding. We are so happy to have you. And what we were discussing was the historical context of Black women and their engagement, not only in politics as political elected officials, but in the context of grassroots advocacy and the like. And so we were just talking about Black women's engagement in the Women's Suffrage March, and Shirley Chisholm just being elected to Congress as the first Black woman in 1968. And so before we continue, I wanted to kind of pivot to something that Dr. Reverend Sora Gould mentioned, which was that a lot of the Black women who engaged in advocacy in public service did not have a political background, in essence. They did not come from that experience. They didn't study political science and then become public servants. In fact, Shirley Chisholm served as an elementary school teacher before running for Congress and becoming the first Black woman to be elected to Congress. Stacey, I think that the experience of Shirley Chisholm and so many Black women not having that experience but still stepping into those roles is not unique. Can you talk about how you came to be involved in advocacy and politics and how you've been able to transfer the skills of your regular everyday life to be effective in that space?
Yes, sure. I think I was born in the early 70s, so I came after a lot of the advancements that were made in the civil rights era. So I think I always grew up assuming that this is just the way life always is, and I was always very aware that I was a recipient of the struggle that came before me. My family would always tell stories about the civil rights era and what it was like to be African American and growing up. And so I think I always sort of thought maybe I'd missed the struggle, but in 2016 really was a wake-up call in terms of me getting involved. You read my bio. I was a teacher and a sign language interpreter, so it wasn't like I was a community activist. But in 2016, I really felt like it was my turn to get involved in sort of the flow of history. I was always aware that there was a flow of history, that Shirley Chisholm was a part of it. I love that you brought up the history of the suffragettes, because I had always heard about the Susan B. Anthonys of the world, or the Katie Stantons of the world, but to come to learn about the Ida B. Wells of the world and the other people who were involved, because I think I knew that white women got the vote in 1920, but I'd heard enough stories to know that it was a different situation for African American women. So to your point, in 2016, I sort of just literally laminated a protest sign and started hitting the streets with every protest that I could find. And then eventually I started to see the same people at the protests. And so it's like, oh, hey, what are you doing? And what organizations are you involved with? And so I actually, my first involvement really heavily politically was with the Democratic Party as a precinct captain, which I was sort of, if you were organizing, you'd be organizing people like me. So I was not the organizer. I would, what do you want me to do? I will go do it. And so that's how I got involved with it, doing a lot of get out the vote activities, lots of voter education activities. I knocked the doors in my precinct. It's like the smallest area. It's the smallest sort of geographic voter area. If you have congressional districts or House districts, then you get down to the precinct level. So it's just a few neighborhoods. And so I was responsible for all the Democrats in my neighborhood. So I spent a lot of time knocking doors, talking to people, voter education. Do you know where to vote? Do you know who's on the ballot? And I did that for a couple of years. And then in 2019, I was approached to run for Senate. Brandon Woodard, I tell the story, and I always give him a shout out. He is my House representative, and he sat me down and he said, hey, listen, I want you to, actually, he said, I got the message that he wanted to have coffee with me. And I was like, oh, Brandon wants to have coffee with me. What's this about? And honestly, the truth was I thought, oh, he wants me for a photo op. I really thought he wants, little did I know he wanted me to run for Senate. And so I said, okay, yes, I will run for Senate, and that's how I got involved. So I sort of jumped in feet first, not truly knowing everything that was going on with it. In fact, I had met you before that when I was the precinct captain. I was on one of your podcasts, or your vlog type situations, talking about the election in 2018. So I ran for Senate, and that was definitely an interesting experience. The district where I am is in Johnson County, Olathe, DeSoto, and Gardner, so it's not like an inner city area at all. So I knew that running as a Black woman was going to be, actually, I don't know what I thought was going to happen, to tell the truth. But I knew it was going to be interesting, putting my face on walk cards with my twists, and my natural hair, and to run as a Black woman out where I did. And honestly, it was a wonderful experience. It was a lot of hard work. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about the people who were around me. But I didn't make it over the finish line as the winner in that one, but we closed the gap over the last one. So I narrowed that 20-point spread from the last time the seat was contested down to 4. So it really showed that a black woman can be competitive out in, at least in, in southern western Johnson County, and I think that will do a lot. Even when I was running, I think I was aware of the fact that the chances of me winning that seat it was going to be a long slog. Like I said, the previous time the seat had been contested, the Democrat had lost by 20 percentage points, which is a pretty long spread. But I knew even when I was running, because I had told Brent, I said, "Oh, you're running me as a sacrificial cow," and he said, "No, we want you to run hard. We want you to run who you are. We want you to run." And so I said, "Okay, I will run as myself, and I'll run hard," and we closed the gap. But even as I was running, I was aware of the fact that I may not win, but someone's going to watch me. Someone's going to watch that run and say, "Okay, she got closer." So even if I don't run again, that there are other people who could potentially watch me and say, "Okay, she did that, I can run." Like, for example, I know I had watched Dawn Rattan run for Shawnee Mission City Council, right? And it's the same thing. She didn't win, but I had watched her, like, from Olathe, and said, "Okay, she ran, she survived, maybe I can do it." So I think there's benefit of, if I take the lessons from history, the people who strive to get me the right to vote, if I take the lessons from, like the ancestors, that I'm following my ancestors, well, I also need to be a good ancestor. That's right. And continue to not just take the sacrifices that people made to pave the way for me to be able to run and say, "Okay, I'm gonna run," right? Like you mentioned, Stacey Abrams ran and she didn't win.
Well, and I think that's a very interesting concept. As we talk about Shirley Chisholm, she did not win her bid for presidency. Right. I don't even think she got over 11% of the vote, and I don't think she was able to, in the end, garner any delegates at the DNC. When we look at Stacey Abrams, she was not able to win her race. Even in your race, you weren't able to get the win on paper, so to speak. But I do think that there's something to be said for what I would call tilling the soil. Yes. and creating the path. And when I think about what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia and then what happened in 2020 and 2021, I think a lot of the success in those election years could be attributed to Stacey Abrams' work to identify voters who hadn't been touched previously during her gubernatorial run. Same thing with you, same thing with Dawn, who is also an African-American woman who ran for that seat.
Who's running now also. She's running for Johnson County Community College Board of Trustees, so Dawn Rattan.
Which I'm excited to hear that you don't not ever run again if you don't win. When I work with candidates and I run campaigns, I always ask initially that they identify the win outside of actually winning the seat, because there's a lot that can be gained in running for office. And so how have you defined a win, and how have you leveraged your run for office to continue to affect policy? And I would like to ask the two of you the same question, because you come from very, very different spaces. As an organizer with a faith background and in the faith sector, I imagine that wins are hard to come by and very complex to identify. And Councilwoman Robinson, you've run for and have held office before you're a public office holder. And so hearing that from the three of you, I think could help give us some context. How do you define a win, whether you win the seat or not? And if you don't win the seat, how do you continue to affect policy without having the title of the seat?
During my campaign, I went on to, took part of the Hope Walk in Olathe. And the organizer was an African-American man, and part of the walk, it was a rather long walk, and so he had his children in a stroller. And so this little black girl, she reached down to pick up a flower, and she dropped it. And so I reached down and picked it up and handed it to her, and she said, "Thank you," and looked up at me, and she said, "She looks like me." I was like, okay, done my job. So, but how do I continue to affect policy? The win got me on the radar of Governor Laura Kelly, and so now I'm in the position that I am now as the Executive Director of the African American Affairs Commission. So that serves as a liaison between the African American community and the governor's office. And so I think there's definitely space to affect policy moving forward in this new position.
You want to go, sis?
Yeah, so, I mean, even in holding public office, there are a lot of, things that you try and things that you want to see happen after having the seat that don't necessarily materialize. And so it is, critically important to talk about and to think about what a win is. And that's, agenda building, really trying to define what are those wants, wishes, and desires of the people that you're representing, and getting them closer to the win that they identify with. So there's been a lot of policies that I've introduced that, weren't able to get 7 votes, but that voice was out there, and that we can continue to build the agenda and build a narrative of what it is that we hope to see in Kansas City's 3rd district. And so winning is relative, and you definitely have to be clear about what those wins are. And just because you're not able to garner the votes in many different categories, people still are aware of what success looks like, what that destination is, and you can continue to march towards that.
But Councilwoman Robinson, I'd like to dig a little deeper. As a Black woman that has been called to serve as a public official, I think there seems to be a balance or a tightrope that you have to walk. And when I say that, I think about former President Obama and his remarks that he's not the president of Black people, he's a president of all Americans. As a councilwoman, how do you balance having to be the councilwoman for everyone in your district, but still passing policies and working on behalf of Black women who no doubt voted for you to work on their behalf?
Absolutely, and so you do have to look at things from a citywide perspective. Although I am an in-district representative, my district is the Blackest district, and so there is some coverage for my agenda because I'm representing the individuals that live there, and my sole focus should be on their liberation or their elevation. But it is a diverse area. I mean, the Kansas City Chiefs Stadium, the Royal Stadium, those are assets within the 3rd district. And so it is about listening and segmenting the market, if you will, and trying to understand what the agenda is for smaller groups of people and building their voice as well. So it's not just, and I think oftentimes yes, I ran because of my social engagement, my civic engagement in the African American community. I've always worked for African American run nonprofit organizations. So that's a backdrop that I have that I want to stay true to, and has led me to office to help Black and brown children make sure that they have accredited school district to go to, and to ensure that there is economic mobility for a lot of Black and brown people who are making $12,000 a year and have children. So you have to stay true to that, and if I get too broad, then I won't be able to accomplish those very keen things that I set out to do. But at the same time, I have to recognize that it is a diverse district. And so, for an example, today I was on the bike ped, conversation about, how do we have residents that are defining what bicycle lanes look like in the 3rd district, whereas in the historically Black neighborhoods, bike lanes in a coffee shop is a sign for gentrification, and oh my God, it's a threat. But there are areas in my district in which people do cycle, and they are commuter cyclists, and that's important to them. And so you have to be an acupuncturist a lot in what you do, so that you're speaking for not necessarily to please everyone, but recognizing the diversity of each neighborhood and building that agenda and helping everyone succeed in that way. But it is something that you have to be intentional about. I think to myself daily, I don't want to be seen as the person who only cares about Black issues. I am Black, but white people voted for me as well. Asian people voted for me as well. And there are issues that do, transcend just focusing on race. But, it's an intentional thing that you have to work on and build an agenda around what people are expecting you to do.
It sounds like quite the tightrope, and again, Dr. Reverend Gould, I'm sure you know about that, being at the intersection of political engagement, advocacy, and religion, of all places. Talk about that tightrope and how you, as an organizer, on top of that, define a win and create wins.
Yeah, I'm reminded, again, Stacey Abrams, she reminds us that the way to win is to try. For me, the role of religion is around what Walter Brueggemann calls prophetic imagination. And so it is looking at what is, right? Looking at the deplorable conditions in some cases of our communities, of our people's lives, right? Looking at the number of homicides in Kansas City and St. Louis that have taken brown and black children's lives and imagining a different world. First imagining that the Creator really had something different in mind and that systems have like impacted this. And then trying to actually cast that vision and working backwards toward making that happen. This past year in 2020, we finally passed Medicaid expansion in Missouri after a 10-year battle. Missouri Faith Voices and Michele serves on our board. We are 10 years old, and we came together to actually imagine equity in healthcare. And it took not just the voters passing it, but also going to court to get it right.
And getting arrested. Didn't a number of clergy people get arrested?
Right,
advocating?
23 of my colleagues, right, in Oregon. And I back then, I would have just said I was a pastor, like I wasn't in the seat of community organizing, at least professionally. And I helped to organize an action. In 2014, we took like 1,000 people into the galley of the State House, and 23 clergy people got arrested and charged, right? And that was like 7 years ago, and it took 6 years even after that just to get it on the ballot, and then to have voters actually affirm it. And so it is, it's a...
Real talk, I'm kind of jealous that you can get that on the ballot. Just tossing that out there.
Well, we can show you the way. We can help you. It takes a lot, though. But it literally was a matter of trying. I often say that justice is a marathon. And so it can't be like this one-off thing as we talk about black women in politics. So yeah, we have these stories of losses, right? But then we try again. There's a sister in Platte County outside of Kansas City who, Dr. Gina Ross, she's running for U.S. Senate. She actually ran for Congress in 2020, won the primary but lost the actual general. And she just got up and she's gonna try again, right? And mostly because people have paved the way. Mostly because she's imagining like something different happening, and there being people in the highest offices in the land that actually look like her, right? She's imagining those little girls and little boys saying, man, they look like me, right? And so really the pathway really starts with imagination, like having to actually name like what is wrong. You know, I'm a Christian pastor, so, you know, Jesus like, that's a demon. And then you call it out. And so, like, we have to name, like, our social demons. Like, it's not right that people don't have Medicaid expansion, or they don't have insurance when they make, for a family of four making less than $18,000. Like, they should still have health care, right? So we call it out, and then we figure out, like, what is the plan to actually change that reality so that people's lives are impacted differently, and that we're not just looking at what is. You know, Shirley Chisholm could have looked at what is and said, yeah, no, a black woman or a black person has never done this, right? We have your sorority sister, our vice president, who did her bid, but I'm thinking if she would not have run, she might not even be in the office that she's in now, right?
Because she lost her run for president.
Exactly.
Right.
She bowed out. She didn't lose. She stepped out.
So being able to actually try. And I think that we're in an era that more people in this moment should be trying, right? More black women. I'm looking for the day that they're not just, and there's a role for organizing and activists and operatives, but there are black women, just ordinary black women who might be watching on YouTube, who are saying, you know, I can try whether it's school board, the mayor's office, or the presidency, and I'm willing to actually, you know, get my feet wet. It's a risky business, but actually just trying that. Our organization has a C4 component. as well. So we do some deep political engagement. We don't endorse. But in 2018, we were able to lead the organizing on the ground in St. Louis. They got rid of a 27-year incumbent in the prosecutor who was known as the Ferguson prosecutor. And people didn't believe that it would happen. But we just imagined that something different could happen. And now there's a young African-American man who was relatively unknown, and he has a seat 27 years later, right? But it comes with imagination and then coordination. Like, you gotta collaborate with people to have a plan to make something different happen.
Well, it seems like the imagination has been sparked. In 2018, we saw the largest number of women of color come into Congress, and
Yes.
then Senator Kamala Harris was a part of that class, making her one of, I think, only 4 black women to be elected to Senate, if I'm not mistaken. In 2020, we saw the largest number of black women running for office across the country. Over 400 black women had put their name on the ballot for seats at every level of government. And so I think the imagination has been sparked. I think black women have outvoted every voter demographic. Numerically, not only in presidential elections, but black women voted for now President Joe Biden in the highest numbers during the 2020 election.
That's
so
right.
on some level, President Joe Biden is in office because of the efforts of black women. What is this increased engagement, whether it be in running for office or electing officials to Congress, what does that mean for the different parties or seats at every level? When you look at the fact that black women voted for President Joe Biden in such strong numbers, upwards of 81%, over 81%, that's a very high number of black women voting for a Democratic ticket. What does that mean for Republicans and the Republican Party, and what does that mean in your summation for black women running for seats down ballot? If anyone wants to answer that.
I mean, I am always going to champion black women running for office no matter what the level of office is, because I think the more diverse we can have the people who are in the room making decisions, that's going to be better for everybody who's involved. I think if you to your point, if you can have the black woman sort of be on your side, that's you're doing something right. And so I think I'm always going to champion people running for office. I think when I was approached, like I said, I go back to that conversation, I was like, I don't know if I'm qualified. I'm not a lawyer. You know, I started to doubt myself. Like, can I do it? And I think I love what you said about the imagination. You just have to do it. Take the leap.
Yeah, you have to take the lead, because we have black women who are spokes people and leaders for different parties and different segments of the Democratic Party.
Right.
You have Nina Turner, who is very much a face for the progressive movement, and as a black woman, you have Candace Owens, who is very much a face for conservatism.
She's a face of something. But I do want to say, not just to run for office, but I think even having more black women involved at various levels that may not be the face, right? So I think, because let's face it, running for office may not be for everyone. But to have more black women running campaigns, or to have more black women being involved in being someone's social media manager or a treasurer. So I think just encouraging people to get involved at various levels. So if a black woman's watching this saying, I don't know if I could run for office, because I think there's a special breed of crazy people who actually run. So you must be that special breed of crazy. I see you.
She said she was an AKA, so.
Oh, hey, I see.
I'm gonna stop Razzie.
It's okay.
Okay, that's all right.
She knows the truth.
But so if that's not everyone's special breed of crazy, there is definitely places to get involved in the political spectrum where I do think our voices should be heard. I think, if it's on a policy side, I think it's important to have black voices in those rooms to speak out and say, hey, well, like you mentioned, if the bike lanes and the coffee shops are going to read as gentrification, we need to know that, right, before they just say we're going to put in bike lanes and coffee shops. But to have those voices in the room to bring different perspectives, I think, is an important part, even if the person doesn't run for office.
Yeah, I would agree. We had a black woman run here in Kansas for local office in 2018, and she wasn't able to win her seat. but she was known to be a black female Republican. And as we talk about black people not being a monolith, I think that we do have to have the discussion about black women's role in politics if it's not with the Democratic Party,
Right.
Or if it's not with or as a moderate Democrat. So I'd be interested, or even if it's to run for local office where partisanship may not play a role, but where the seat is important because it impacts black lives. I think of Kim Gardner, the circuit attorney out in St. Louis, who also unseated an incumbent, won her race handedly, and has been at the forefront because in that seat of criminal justice reform in St. Louis.
Yeah. I'll add, so I think part of it is that all of the parties on all of the sides of the aisle, they have to be accountable to black women, right? For those who follow social media, there's the hashtag Trust Black Women, and that's a real thing. And if parties are going to be successful in the state of Missouri, we have a former senator that is now on MSNBC because she was a moderate Dem and ran in the middle of the road. The middle of the road just gets you hit by a truck. Literally, people have to literally choose the side and choose the side of the people that are really impacted, right? Even beyond, partisan politics. I think we're in an era of really toxic partisanship right now. But what is the moral agenda, right? What is morally right for the least of these? And you don't have to be a person of faith to actually have this sense of morality. But successful politicians are going to have to recognize that black women, as the most loyal voting bloc in America, our issues, our agenda, what's important to us, our families, our communities, has to actually be dealt with as a part of policies and agendas. And that's on both sides of the aisle. It also means that Republicans can't ignore us. It also means that Dems can't take us for granted and cannot just sit behind what the numbers say and, they're going to vote for us anyway. There has to be an accountability for what is important to us and what is important to our progeny, our children lives. Like you said, we'll become ancestors, and we owe our community something. And so I believe that is what we really have to focus on, in upcoming elections, what politicians had better be focusing on.
And what I'll add is that it does take, getting to the polls is the foundational point, right? And it does read that, there is an opportunity for black women's issues and the things that we care about to go from A through Z in terms of all the way to actually bringing about change. But we do have to pivot in our demands. And so that process between getting a person elected to actually seeing the agenda set and actually following that agenda to make sure that we're not being pandered to, that is critical. Because what I find is that during the election season, it's okay, yes, the narrative is going to swing in our direction because they know that it's important to get us to the polls, and that's what's going to get us to show up. But after, November is over, what are we doing to stay engaged and to stay motivated, to say, okay, this is what was said, but this is what you're doing, and this is in an alignment, and there's a consequence for that. And so until we start to talk about what those consequences are and not sell wolf tickets, then we're going to continually be the people who are knocking on doors, energizing people to vote, getting people elected, and then we're still, 2 years later, 4 years later, what's happening? And there's a challenge and there's a struggle, from an elected's point of view, where I'm okay, where my people at?
Yeah.
I'm talking about making sure that neighborhoods can say whether or not they want a bike lane, and I need you to show up. Now, our forums are on Zoom. There's no excuse for you not to show up and testify. there's no excuse for you not to be engaged. And those phone calls and the letters, the emails, they sway so much, and they're extremely effective.
And
so
it doesn't take a lot.
It
Would you
doesn't-
say that's the case, Councilwoman?
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't take a lot. So we can't just, voter registration is important, getting people to the polls, yes, they're important, but agenda setting and holding people accountable and staying engaged until that policy is passed, until that vision is realized, we have to get over that hump.
Again, I have to go back to community organizing, right? Because it is in community organizing that political education happens. So pretty much anybody can mobilize, right? You just call up some people and say, hey, let's go do this. But organizing is a longer arc. And so I talked about the 2018 St. Louis County prosecutor's race. We also created a prosecutor's accountability table that's still meeting, that puts us in conversation, that talks about policies, that pushes back. It's not just a rubber stamp endorsement. And so that long-term engagement matters. But I also want to say that I think that politicians also have to be a little more innovative. You started off by talking about the innovation of the Dole Institute. So when we start talking about Black and brown communities, the digital divide is real. So one of the things that we found in 2020, when we're still living in this pandemic, instead of we would have 50 to 75 paid phone bankers in a church fellowship hall, making calls, and we're like, oh, you can call from the comfort of your own home. That's great, but I don't have internet, right? That's great, but my cell phone, I don't have a smartphone with a good plan. And if I make these calls, some of them are out of my area code, it's going to cost me money. And so I think that we really, policymakers as well, and people who run campaigns and organizers, have to actually be responsive to the needs of the community. And what seems like really simple to us, like, oh, great, I can just sit in my dining room and make these calls. When you are dealing with, this is Maslow's hierarchy, when people are trying to figure out the food on their table, then they're less inclined to worry about the bike lanes. They're like, a bike lane, right? And so I think the way that one of the things that I've really learned in organizing is taking it to the people and meeting them wherever they are, wherever that might be. And it's often in ways that we're not imagining because most of us are not living our lives with those kind of constraints. And so I think in this season, this kind of next chapter of political engagement in 2022 and in 2024, it's going to take some innovation. It's going to take some reality checks around like what people need. And I do think soon that there will probably be a time of reckoning with Black women in voting, saying, hey, we're not just going to keep supporting you. And because on the one hand, you got the people who may not show up, that you're like, where am I tribe? But on the other hand, we also have politicians who only show up for us like every 4 years. As a church pastor, if I had not seen you in my community and inside my church building, you would not get a chance to talk to my congregation on Sunday morning. Now, if you've been in my church, you've come to community events, we know you because of your role in the community, I'll let you talk, never from my pulpit. When Governor Nixon, I had a huge forum at my church, and they were doing his mic and his Secret Service and all that, and it's like, they were like, he'll stand here. I was like, no, he won't. He's the governor, I'm the pastor, he'll stand down there and he'll speak. And I think it takes that kind of clarity, right?
Yes.
And the community operating out of our own power as well, that's gonna make a really big difference.
I think so, and as an operative who's had to accompany elected officials at churches and being told that, no, you're going to stand down there and have them explain that. There is great power in that. I can attest to that. Don't ask me how I know. Yes. Don't ask me how I know. If you are watching us live and want to join in on the discussion, be sure to email us at dolequestions@ku.edu. You all have hit on something that I think is very important, that Black women are highly engaged, but we don't always see the fruits of our labor, so to speak. When I think about, Shirley Chisholm running for president, there was a groundswell of women that ran for Congress shortly after she ran for president. A lot of those women that ran, and one, we're not black women. When I think about black women's engagement in social movements and activism, black women have always been the strategists, the women in the kitchen cooking for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all of these other leaders. You know, we think about Rosa Parks on the bus, but we don't remember or know that Rosa Parks was a part of that strategy planning. When we think about the Me Too movement, recent movements, black women were the leaders of that movement, but weren't always the recipients of change. When we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, that was a movement that was led by black women and black women who identified as LGBTQ+, but we often don't hear about the stories of police brutality that black women suffer. I always mention the Holtzclaw case in Oklahoma. That's the story of the officer who essentially preyed on black women and committed a sexual assault and was charged with sexually assaulting over 13 black women. He admitted to choosing black women because he knew that if they were to come forward, no one would believe them. And that story didn't gain the same national attention or attraction that Michael Brown and some of the other victims of police brutality experienced. It took a black woman, Teslyn Figueroa, to bring it to the national dialogue. She'll be with us for our session next week, but it took a black woman working for free to bring that to our attention. It's a story that's lost. And it's interesting that that's the story that's lost because the most reported offense against police officers is sexual violence. So with that being said, how do we connect the dots, or how do black women connect the dots? Because what history has told us is that when black women lead, everybody wins. It may not be black women, but everybody wins. How do we connect the dots between black women's engagement and advocacy and activism to actual political change and policy change? And if we could start with you, Councilwoman Robinson, and then work our way back this way.
Absolutely. Again, I'll certainly double down on the importance to stay engaged. It is critically important. So when you find that there's barriers for your engagement, we need to address that. So when cities are receiving $100 million of American Rescue Plan money and you don't have the internet, that's the problem. Yeah. So let's figure out what those barriers are to make sure that we can keep people engaged along the way, and to make sure that we connect those dots, and to ensure that we're providing that education about what it does take in order to win. And when we talk about win, it's not about, you know, again, how many votes we got, but it's what types of change actually occurred by my contribution. And that, you know, again, is critically important. The reason why everybody wins when black women engage is because, for the most part, black women have a unique experience in America that speaks to strife, overcoming, and supporting people to make sure that their needs are getting met. And so there is a unique productive capacity that comes from a lot of trauma that's experienced that is able to help everyone. So that when I'm looking at a piece of legislation, I'm looking at it from the lens of where I grew up, who my family is, the hopes and dreams that I have for my children, and not from a place of privilege, but it's from a real place of how do we help everybody succeed? Because when you're at the table and you're not succeeding, you have a totally different view of what's happening in front of you. So when you do get at the table, you want to make sure that other people aren't positioned where you were positioned, and that's why everybody wins, because of that unique productive capacity. And so I think making sure that we're doing all of the things that were said here, that we're getting involved in races, we're running, we're participating, we're building agendas, and we're holding people accountable and not looking for lanes to exit, because I believe that we are so involved in the political process because it's a life or death situation. If we're not involved, people perish. And so that that requires us to stay connected, and not just, say, okay, we got to get this Medicaid expansion, which thank the Lord Jesus that we got that passed in Missouri. And it's now about, like, how are we training community health workers, health ambassadors, the barbers, the beauticians, the pastors, on how to get people to actually enroll and make those connections, so that we're actually addressing and eliminating health inequities, because people have access to better health care, but then we're also holding the healthcare providers accountable, so they're not treating you like you shouldn't be treated when you're in their presence. And so how are we doing that to make sure that we're creating this ecosystem for real change? So we have to be firing on all cylinders. It's not, this niche thing that we need to be doing. It does take a comprehensive, complex approach.
Well, and I think that Black women fire on all cylinders, and we're tired.
Yeah.
How do we deal
Child.
with? How do we deal? I'm tired right now. It's rainy outside, and this is good. We don't have time to be tired. We don't have time to be tired.
We need allies. We need help, and that means, hashtag trust Black women. And I tell people on the council every day, and I'm not that old, I will say, but I'm like, if you all would have just listened to me when I said that
part.
3 months ago, we wouldn't be in this situation.
That part.
So,
You're right.
and I hate that, because I'm like, dang, I sound like my mama or my grandmother. But it's,
If you had just done what I told you.
again, leaning into that, understanding the perspective, and that people should trust us because of, just our uniqueness and our place within America.
Well, and the historic experience that when you trust us, everybody wins. How do we continue to, and then I would love for the two of you to take the initial question and to lean into this also, but how do we continue to stay strong and not be tired when we are producing, we are creating pathways? We have, for instance, a Democrat majority in the House. We have a Democrat majority in the Senate. We have a Democrat in the White House. We have the first Black woman vice president who is the head of the Senate in the tie-breaking vote. So we have everything in place. We did what we needed to do. We came out to vote, and the George Floyd Act will not be passed. And voting rights will not likely, if not already, be passed. And a lot of the key issues that Black women came out on a Tuesday in November during a pandemic to vote for, and voted elected officials to make way on these issues are not coming through to fruition. How do you continue to be strong when we see that our efforts don't always create the fruit that they were intended to create? And again, how do we move our activism, our voting, our engagement, our power, our trauma that we pull out of ourselves to create change? How do we utilize all that to create actual policy change?
Well, I'm taking a yoga retreat this weekend, just the simple answer. I think we don't have a choice. Like, to an extent, I almost feel like I don't have a choice, right? Because if we stop, like, what's the alternative, right? So I want to join you in doubling down on this idea of holding people accountable. And so if we have a Democratic president, and we have a Democratic Senate, we have a Democratic, president of the Senate, and the Democrat, all that stuff on the federal level, and if in Kansas we have a Democratic governor, but we have a supermajority of Republicans in the legislature, I agree. I will join with you and say that the thing that we need to continue to do is continue to show up and make our voices be heard, because I do believe that if a politician thinks that they will honestly lose their seat, they will do what their constituency tells them. So I believe that even if there undoubtedly are some ideologues who will just, I don't care what the constituency says, but I do believe the lion's share of politicians, if they really thought, I will not win this next election, they can be swayed. So, for example, redistricting is coming up, and we all know it's coming. And so the African American Affairs Commission has joined with Mainstream Coalition and the League of Women Voters to get the word out, hey, we need to pay attention. So even though on paper it may not look like this is going to go our way, but we need to make sure that the voices are continually being heard. And I can't agree with you enough about that situation. I was talking with Senator Faustido earlier this year, and she was talking about some piece of legislation that probably had to do with criminal justice reform. And when it came time to have testimony to be given in the committee hearing, she's like, why? She said, why was I the only black person in that room? Right? So me now in doing this position, I have taken it upon myself that, you know, my office is right across the street from the State House. If push comes to shove, I will show up at everything. But before that, I've taken upon myself to make sure that I try to get the word out to the African American community. Hey, this is coming through the pipeline. Submit testimony. Hey, this is coming through the pipeline. Hold them accountable. You know, hey, this is coming through the pipeline. Would you be willing to show up and give testimony? There was a wonderful turnout for the redistricting hearing in Wyandotte County. So I know that if people know that they need to show up, people will show up. There was a large turnout in Johnson County, but there was a large turnout in Sedgwick County. There was a large number of African American people came out in Sedgwick County and in Wyandotte County. And so I think there's a certain amount of the average voter, I'm not sure, maybe the average voter, because we live and breathe and eat and sleep politics, right? So like, you know, I know what's going on. You know, I always say it's like it's my hallelujah heroin and reason to breathe. But the average person may honestly think, oh, if I voted for him,
Right.
That's it.
I'm good, I'm done, I voted for him. But I think there is a certain amount of continuing to educate and continue to say, hey, you need to show up. Like there's a committee meeting, they're gonna talk about these bike lanes. If you want bike lanes, please show up. Hey, we're going to talk about something that's going on in Ferguson. You need to show up. Or hey, there's, you know, the Crown Act is going through the legislature. You need to show up. So I think just knowing that we need to continue to stay involved.
And that voting is only the first step.
Voting is only the first step, a
Very
crucial
first
first step,
step.
but
Right.
it is
Yeah.
literally the first step.
Yeah.
Reverend Dr.
Yeah.
Gould, black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and we can't get these things passed. How do we continue to stay strong, and how do we create policy change with our activism and engagement?
You know, I think that even voting is often an act of protest. It's an act of protesting what you don't want. I've spent a lot of my life in Missouri, but I'm from a little town in Alabama, Demopolis, Alabama, 47 miles from Selma, where my mother was on that bridge, went to jail. I remember being a little girl, and I'm old enough that I was born then. I don't remember. I just remember the story she told me. I remember being a little girl, and I was like, Mom, did you march with Dr. King? She was like, I was there before, while he was thinking about coming. She was a college student, right? Just feeling the need to do her part. I think the more that we're able to educate people to be in conversation and community with people, to build relationships with people, and entice and encourage them to do their part, to remind them that they have a part, like that starts to make a difference. For some, it is enough just to go vote, right? And then they're just like, oh, but you said you would do this, and I counted on you to do this, and they get, you know, like really disenfranchised or just disenchanted, actually, with the process. We have to hold accountable, even our friends, on whatever side your friends are on. We have to hold accountable elected officials to what they said that they would do. And remind them that there is also a price to pay for that, right? I think we're entering into an era that, and Bernie Sanders is proof of that, right? The squad is proof of that. The election of Congresswoman Cori Bush, proof of that. We're really getting to beyond this bifurcation of these two parties, right? It's going to be not just an either or, but a both and plus. And so that is the innovation, that is the creativity that we have to think about. If these people do not, and whoever these people are, don't represent us all the time in these offices, then who are the people that are actually going to represent us and represent the values and the ideals that they lied and said they would, right? And so how are we then protesting them at the ballot box? And how are we cultivating the bench? The bench of politicians, the bench of organizers. Black women are tired, and black women need to figure out how to rest. That's a real thing too. I had a really horrible car accident last year that literally left me out of the game, and I mean literally out of the game for like 9 months. And the world kept going around. The day of the Medicaid vote, I'd had my second surgery out of 4. I didn't even know my name. I woke up at like 10 p.m. and I was like, oh, it's August 4th, right? Medicaid still passed without me. And so we also have to like honor ourselves and our bodies, and not actually like operate under the pretense that we don't get tired or that, right? We are the most important thing that we have. I think there's a quote by Audre Lorde. And so we have to protect that. And we have to also remind even elected officials and others who tend to actually use the face of black women often, use the energy and the intellect of black women to get things done. And we have to be in collaboration with each other. I often tell, churches, religious bodies, that you have to not just be in conversation with the pastor across the street, but with the community members that actually don't trust your church and don't trust you enough to come into your building, so you have to go to them. Politicians also have to be in conversation, in coordination with grassroots organizations. The collaboration, the co-creation of, back to that imagination of doing something different, is how we're going to get past like where we are right now. And the reality is, yeah, we got all of those things, and where we are right now is really not ideal, and it's not good, and we're all afraid of what's going to happen in 2024. It's going to be really toxic, and there are going to be a lot of losers, like in so many different kinds of ways, and we have to prepare ourselves for that, like not just politically, but mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and et cetera. And so we got to be strategic.
And one of the things I will say is that, culturally, we try not to badmouth or disparage other elected officials who look like us, and so oftentimes we have challenges with calling people to task and holding people accountable, because we start to make up, they have to be the representative for everyone, or they have to, politics is about compromise, or no, either you're bringing the agenda that you said you were going to do, or you're not.
Right.
So it's
Period.
not any gray area in between. And there's different strategies, because not always what you do is how you do it, right? But everybody, I like to say that, like Shirley Chisholm, I'm unbossed and unbought, but there is a price.
Come on.
Everybody has a price. And so if a 62-year-old African-American woman calls my house my house or my office with the complaint, that's my price, because that is the constituency that elected me to get into office. Right. So I'm going to listen to Sister Thomas. I don't care what I'm doing, when I'm doing it. Now, I might not listen to, somebody who wants a big tax break or something, but we all have something that will hold us accountable. Yeah. And it's not very difficult to find out what that is. That's right. And we have to tap into that and engage in that space.
Yeah. I want to say one more thing. You reminded me. This is the other thing. So oftentimes we don't engage with politicians we didn't vote for. I got 2 senators. I didn't vote for them, right? However, they are still the senators of Missouri. And even when I know that their political ideology is in contrast to that, I am still going to call your office sometimes twice a day and remind you that people in Missouri need X, Y, and Z. And so we also have to be better, again, the political education piece, about how we actually teach people to engage, particularly with people who they're opposed to their brand of politics. Because what happens is they can say, none of the people in Missouri said we wanted voter rights. And they're right. Their constituency doesn't care about voter rights. And so it is also just reminding people that elected officials still report to you, even if you didn't vote for them.
You know,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, no, that, yeah.
I was going to say, because Brandon Woodard is still my House representative, and it's also important to let the people who you did vote for, who you do agree with,
That's right.
to
All of that.
contact them as well. Because there are
Yeah.
times if I'm watching the Kansas legislature and something's coming up and Brandon going to have to take a vote on something, I will email him and say, hey, I want you to know that I agree with this. Because then it also, they can say, my constituents have told me that this
That's
is
right.
something that they want me to do.
That's
so
right.
it still goes to the whole keep involved.
Stay involved.
You know, so I may send a letter to, in fact, I will oftentimes just CC both of them just to save me the space so that neither one of them can say, well, I didn't hear from people in the district.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be the first thing an elected official says if they are pushed one way or another. I didn't hear from my constituents on this issue, so this must, or I did hear from my constituents,
Right.
and the constituents could just be 10 people because
Yeah.
they're the only 10 people to reach out,
Right.
and that informs how they make policy decisions. Because at the end of the day, politicians see a number of decisions and have a number of things, issues that they have to create policy around, and so making your voice heard and holding that elected official accountable seems to be the way that Black women and any of us can effectuate policy and create policy change. And with that, we will open the floor for questions. Because of the help of the SAB, the Student Advisory Board, we are able to host these sessions. They keep me in line, they send me great emails, and they bring the mic when there are questions. So I'm going to open the floor to anyone that has questions. If you could raise your hand if you have a question so we can get the mic to you.
Any questions?
Ago, we were talking about how Hillary Clinton, a study found that Hillary Clinton lost a lot of her votes because of her likability. She wasn't likable enough. Being a woman, and on top of that, being a Black woman, how do you find the balance between being likable, being professional, getting things done without being too aggressive during campaign season?
Ooh, the angry
That's a
Black
great
woman.
question,
Dang.
yeah, because it doesn't take much to be deemed an angry Black woman or to be deemed difficult or hard to work with or not likable. That's a very fine line, if it even exists.
Yeah. You know, I entered into the space of being the ED of this grassroots organization 6 years ago, and it put me in a room with other EDs. At one point, I was the only Black woman in the room, and that room has grown, but not a lot. And one of the things that I was faced with was like divorcing my intellect from my intuition. For Black women, intuition is a really big thing, right? And I had to realize, like, no, this is a part of my intellect, and people will make you second guess yourself. So it's also a way in which you're being authentic to yourself. And knowing that there will be people who, like, that might be a good excuse as to why they didn't vote for you, right? But it hadn't, you could have, like, did everything they said do. I still go back to the senator who's now on MSNBC. She was literally playing to a particular audience, and that same audience wasn't going to vote for her anyway. And so I think that was some of the things with Senator Clinton. And I also think there were ways in which, even with her, some Black votes were also taken for granted as well. I was in an audience when she stood in a church in a few miles from Ferguson and, you know, said all lives matter in a Black church, you know, while there were still tanks in the street in Ferguson. And I was like, oh my God, this is not going to go well for her, right? And so I think it's a fine line, but your integrity matters more than anything else. And then over time, so when I talked about that 2018 prosecutor race, none of my white counterparts in the city of St. Louis, in the state, who sit at this C3 table that I actually chair, thought that the race was winnable, so they all stood on the sidelines. Well, sometimes you have to also be willing to take a risk. I was being authentic to myself, being authentic to the constituents, and gambling on, like, but I'm imagining something different happening. And so after winning the race and us leading the organizing on it, you know, now I have a white male counterpart who's like, okay, Cassandra, you were right about that, and I was wrong. What are you thinking about this, right? And so some of it is about sticking to your guns and just being who in my case, who God has authentically, made me to be, and not really worrying about the fallout of what if they get mad, what if they demonize me and vilify me. They absolutely vilify you as a black woman particularly, or as a woman of color when you walk in the room anyway. Yeah. And so you're constantly living in that shadow.
And I'll just add really quickly, the authenticity is so critical. You cannot underline that enough of being your authentic self. I'm an introvert, and yes, I am that angry black woman because I'm angry about but you have to turn that anger into action, right? And so I'm angry about the conditions of African Americans in America. And so what are we doing to change that, right? But being an introvert and being someone who will never win a popularity contest as it relates to personality, I have to offset that with hard work and productivity and getting things done, listening to what people have to say and acting upon what their desires are. Because I'm not elected, yes, I have an experience, and yes, that drew me to politics. But at the end of the day, I'm not elected to propel my own desires and wants. I'm elected to be a voice for the people who put me there. And so long as you can say anything you want to say about me, but so long as what you won't say is that I did not do my very best at all times to represent the people who elected me. And so you have to, I think that the times are changing and they understand that change is about action and change is about accountability. And while they may not want to, go to happy hour with me, they want me to be in that legislative seat because they know I'm going to get things done.
I think there's something to be said for getting things done. That transcends gender, it transcends race, it transcends age. When you are the best at what you do, someone cannot like you and still be forced to hire you or work with you. As an operative, I've worked with everyone from Jeff Weaver to the current mayor of Kansas City. I've sat in the back rooms, and I am often the only young person, the only black person, the only woman in a room with men who cuss, who dismiss me, who may say hurtful things, and who will out the gate say she's angry or she's this or she's that as a way to dismiss me so that they don't have to pay attention to me. But you're not going to be able to get around me. Right. If you do work in Kansas or Missouri, you're going to hear my name because I am good at what I do, and that always transcends being liked. You're not always going to be liked. You should try to get along with people, and you have to in this space because relationships are at the core of all of our work. None of us can do the work that we do without relationships, but it's not for me to be in relationship with everybody. It's for me to be in a relationship with the right bodies and to do the best that I can do so that whether you like me or not, you got to come through me. That's right. Next question.
I guess as an ally, like what can I do or what can people like me do to help get more black women engaged with politics?
I will start. I think that people who are not black women have to wield their power, whatever power and privilege that they hold, because we all hold some level of power and privilege. It's just identifying what that is and where it comes from, to influence those closest to us. When we think about levers of influence, the most effective lever of influence is word of mouth from people that you already know and trust. And so having those difficult conversations at Thanksgiving or talking to your friends or being the voice that stands up when things are going wrong around you, being the person that talks to the cops when they're doing something wrong to a black person and leveraging the white privilege and the conversation relatability that you can have when that occurs is an example of how allies can step up and step in. I think the challenge with allies who are not black women is that they're not prepared to make sacrifice. They will only step in so far as that it doesn't impact their jobs or their families or their comfort, whereas black women live a life of discomfort. whether we want to or not. We don't get to retreat from activism and engagement, where allies often can. They can retreat back to the suburbs, you can retreat back to your house, your friend circle, and be totally disconnected to all of the work that Black women are doing to change the lives of everyone. So stepping in from where you are is what we say at Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. Shirley Chisholm stepped in for where she was. She was a census counter. She was an elementary school teacher. She, talked to the people in her neighborhood in Brooklyn when doing the census work, and it was that work that allowed her to be elected to Congress. They knew her by that point when she went to run for Congress. And so taking the same approach of talking to those closest to you, talking to your family members, talking to your friends, supporting organizations that are doing the work, being a listening ear when you're in these spaces instead of looking for where you can contribute. It's not always for you to contribute. Sometimes it's for you to listen and to support and to learn. Be willing to be open and learn. I think those are some ways that allies can step in that will allow them to be contributors to this space and this work, and allow Black women to get a little bit of rest.
My campaign was not run by a bunch of Black women. So if you find someone that you want to support them, right? I mean, I didn't get as close as I did, given the demographics of where I live. I didn't get close as I did because a bunch of Black women voted for me, because there's just not that many Black women there. So there had to be a lot of white people who were on my side. So, I mean, my campaign was run, honestly, it was primarily a bunch of white women. There's only really one man involved. So I think just helping out.
And I will say, just from a Black Lives Matter perspective, I'm learning now more and more that for a lot of liberal white people, Black Lives Matter up until the point that they're uncomfortable. And so that conversation about sacrifice is so real, because you do have to be able to step back and sacrifice your own comfort in order to see the elevation of other folks. And so you would not believe how many white liberal men are coming after me because these bicycle lanes, but it's okay.
I need to read up on the bicycle lane situation.
I know, right?
Clearly a theme. I'm like, what is the bicycle lane?
But I love people. I love it. So we have a conversation about that. But yeah, that sacrifice is so important.
Any other questions? We'll take one more real quick.
There's a lot of talk about people not getting involved enough, and there's some people that just don't know how to. So what would you say to those people that just say I have no idea how to start, where should I go, what should I read, how should I keep track of what's happening in the different legislations and to start getting involved in politics?
And that's a great question. Since we're running short on time, we'll use that as a way to close. Give us one quick tip on how someone can get engaged in advocacy and politics if they're interested. What is the one gateway opportunity that someone could take advantage of? And I will start here to my left with Stacey.
Become a precinct captain of your local party. If it's the Democratic or Republican Party, contact the county party and see how you can become a precinct captain.
When the legislative session is open, look at the issues that you're interested in and just show up at hearings. They're open to the public, and listen and find a grassroots organization to become a part of.
Be an election worker.
Ooh, that's a good one.
That too.
I would say work on a political campaign, volunteer on a political campaign. Representative Barbara Lee out of Oakland, California has been a representative in the U.S. Congress for a number of years, and she got her start by volunteering for Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign. That's how she learned about politics. She was a single mom on food stamps, and her volunteerism with Shirley Chisholm's presidential run is why she's in Congress now. Representative Barbara Lee was the only member of Congress to not vote for the Iraqi war when she was in office. So with that being said, I'd like to thank my panelists, Stacey Knoell, Reverend Gould, Reverend Dr. Sorwer Gould, and Councilwoman Melissa Robinson for joining us this evening. Thank you to the Dole Institute for hosting this discussion series. Thank you to the SAB for doing all the work that they do to make sure these go off without a hitch. We'd like to also make sure we recognize Newman's Own. Because of their generous donation, we are able to have these discussion series. If you're interested in learning more about Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, you can visit our website at www.shirleyskitchencabinet.org. We will be here next week. It'll be our last week. Same time, same place. You can come late, you can leave early. Just make sure you don't miss out. Thank you for joining us today.